Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked, the series where I talk about every single book on my shelf because it's just in my nature, okay? Today I am talking about the first 3 books in the Masquerade or Baru Cormorant series by Seth Dickinson. Don't worry, I will put covers up in the moment. I'm aware these are just a little bit out of focus, but I've got tiny little bird arms. I'm not going to be able to hold them up. If memory serves, I was gifted a copy of the first book by a family member for Christmas in 2020, but books 2 and 3 I was sent review copies for the paperback release for free from the publisher. Regardless of where the books came from, nobody's paying me to talk about books and all opinions are my own. While I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as humanly possible for the series as a whole, I just wanted to warn you that I am going to be talking about the series trajectory. So if you want to go in this with absolutely no idea what's happening or where it might possibly go, generally, I would say probably click away now and come back when you've read it and we can discuss. Lastly, I do have to give a fairly hefty content warning for this series, not for this review as a whole, but for if you're planning on reading these books. I really recommend going and looking up the full list of content warnings. I believe Storygraph is pretty good with content warnings, so I would say maybe try there. I have made a vague list. There's a lot of homophobia, eugenics, discussion of plague and cancer, colonialism, sexism, and heaps more. If there is a specific trigger you want to avoid and you really are keen to read these books, do feel free to drop me a message on social media and I will gladly let you know if it's in there. Obviously, feel free to also do that in the comments, but you know, you might want to do it more privately. I don't know. I'll answer the questions. So this is a 4-part series of which we have currently got 3 parts. We have The Traitor, which came out in 2015, The Monster, which came out in 2018, and The Tyrant, which came out in 2020, but this is the paperback release, which came out in 2021. We don't have the title of the next book. We don't know when it's coming out. Based on the author's note at the end of book 3, my suspicion is it's going to be quite a while. I initially encountered this series when I first started blogging, which would have been around about 2015, so it feels about right for it to have been on all sorts of you need to read these new fantasy books lists. It took me a while to actually pick it up and read it. I can't remember when I read it actually. Did I make a note of that? No, I didn't. But since I did pick up the first one, I've been following the series, but I've been following it with the paperback releases, so probably about maybe 6 months. 6 months on? That feels about right. Mainly because I always need to reread the previous books and that gets harder and harder to do with every new release. The Traitor was Seth Dickinson's first novel. He has written a couple of other things since, but this is primarily what he's known for writing. And his background is in neuroscience, which makes sense when you think about it. This series takes place in a world where there is kind of a trading circle. Things pass around the sea to various different places and kind of all the money starts flowing back to the Masquerade, which is the big It's an evil empire, basically. They're making bank and they are pushing their ideologies on everywhere that they trade with. So the traitor starts with Baru, who is living in one of these places that is just seeing the inklings of the Masquerade turning up. Baru's incredibly intelligent. She ends up going to a school run by the Masquerade. But Baru's a smart one and a patient one, and she opts for the strategy, if you can't beat them, join them, and then take them down from within. So the series kind of follows her climbing the ranks of the empire that she hates and trying to destroy it. In the first book, Baru is sent as the imperial accountant to deal with Arduin, which is a place that basically has killed everyone who's ever tried to rule it. But can Baru succeed where others have failed? And does she actually want to succeed? One of the things that I really like about these books is how it brings in economics. Now, I had to study economics when I did my ancient history degree, and I did it very, very loosely because I don't have much of a good brain for all of the kind of various moving pieces that you need to understand when you understand economics. So there are points of these books that got a little bit confusing for me, but I really liked a story that took subterfuge and strategy, but not from a military standpoint, from an economic standpoint. I think it's a really interesting take and it's one of the things that makes these books stand out from others. We have seen aspects of this in other stories. I'm not saying that all other books ignore economics completely, but to take a book where that is your main character's skill set was really clever. I liked that blend of the economic stuff and fantasy because the economic stuff is stuff that we recognise in the real world, and I think that's really a good way of making it feel a bit relatable and also making it feel very historic despite the fact that it's a very different world from ours. Speaking of it being a very different world from ours, I guess it's not that different because it's a pretty damning take on empire and it doesn't really hold back. A lot of the practices that Seth Dickinson references being used against people in this world, minus a bit of the magical aspects, are things that people did and continue to do in order to press their ideology on other people. And yes, it's super problematic, and I think that in this day and age, you'd be hard-pressed to not know anything about these things, but I always think there's value to exploring those things through a speculative lens, and this series does that really well. There are other books that do it similarly, there are other books from authors of colour who do it similarly, but I really found this interesting mainly because the kind of bleak, gory nature of the book as it's set up lets Seth Dickinson really explore how horrible some of these practices are. I mentioned the whole list of content warnings, that all comes in here. All in all, this series is truly unlike anything else I've ever read in a lot of ways. I'm not saying it's completely unique in every single sense, but I think that the aspects that this book chooses to focus on are really interesting, and truthfully, from the start of book one, I do not think I could have predicted where this story went, because it goes to some pretty odd places. I think it's refreshing in that sense. I think it's got some really good selling points to it. I think it's a good fantasy for if you are feeling a bit stuck in a rut with that kind of thing. It also includes a whole host of queer characters, which I always appreciate. I feel like I should mention that. It's not the happiest time for those characters all the time, but hey, they're there. I do have a few qualms with this series. I've already mentioned that aforementioned list of content warnings. I don't think that's a reason not to pick the book up generally, but obviously that can make aspects of the book quite difficult to read, particularly if something is fairly sensitive to you. I found a lot of the aspects of maybe the second and third book got a little bit too gory for me personally, but that's personal preference. I also found these books very dense, and I don't mean that in a negative sense completely. I just think you need to be in the right place to read them, and also they are quite different from each other in terms of tone, which I think Seth Dickinson has owned. I think he knows for a fact that Monster is very different from Traitor, and was mentioning on some website somewhere about deciding what kind of tone slash how succinct, I guess, the fourth book is going to be. But I know that can annoy people when the books don't feel very similar, so I thought I would mention that. I found aspects of the third book in particular very difficult to get through because it is quite long. It's a hefty, hefty paperback. That doesn't mean I don't think you should read it, but if you're the kind of person who knows you get stuck in really long books, which I definitely do sometimes, time it right. And my final kind of con point is this is an unfinished series at this point. If you watch my vlogs from around that time, you'll know that I really thought this was the end to the trilogy. Turns out it's a quartet. Never mind. So yeah, if you wanted to wait a little bit, at least until we had a release date for the fourth one, I would completely understand, because I personally think that it's nice to read a series all in one go, and to know that you're going to get to the end of it, especially because this is definitely a series that warrants rereading every single time a new book comes out. I just think it makes things make more sense. So I would say if you wanted to pick up this series, wait and see when the fourth book is going to come out and then plan accordingly. In terms of comparisons, other books you might enjoy, I think to the slightly bleak tone of this series and creating characters that you really dislike and having main characters that do things that you don't necessarily understand why they have done them, Robin Hobb is a really good option. If you've read any Hobb, you will know what I'm talking about, but yeah, those books get bleak sometimes. Recent read Sorryland by Rivers Solomon, I think, does another really good thing for looking at exploitation of marginalised people. I think it's really interesting, and another book that definitely goes to places I wasn't expecting it to, so yes, would recommend that. If you did want a big long chunky fantasy that has happier gay stories within it, Priory of the Orange Tree. I'm not saying it's fully happy all the time, but it is happier. Priory of the Orange Tree, it's a good time. My final thoughts on this series so far, it's not my favourite series. I went through a time where I thought I really liked it, and I think I was just trying to be a little bit edgier than I actually am. Having reread the first three, I think I like a lot of aspects about this book. You could cut a lot of it out and I would have a much better time. Like, just give me the economic strategy and taking over the world and I would be okay with that. I don't necessarily need a lot of the other weird things that happen, but I can understand how somebody else might read the series and that would be their favourite thing about it. So I'm not going to judge too harshly. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that this has been informative, educational, exciting. Hopefully we will have a release date for book 4 fairly soon and I can do a standalone video for that to make it work for this series. I don't know. If you've read these, let me know your thoughts. If you haven't read them yet, let me know what your first impression of them has been, because I'd be really interested to know. If there's anything else similar that you think is worth reading, let me know in the comments as well. While you're down there commenting, be sure to subscribe because it makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also follow me on all of my social media. It's all linked in the description below. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. It's gonna be some bloopers now. Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews and to another episode. Oh, let's not do that, shall we? That seems like a bad idea. The Traitor with Seth